and myself, we live and work on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples. That's the Lekwungen language area on the southwestern tip of what the colonial name is Vancouver Island, and ours is the First Nations territory of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanich First Nations peoples. Of course, when we do a Zoom like this across the country, we acknowledge the territories that all of you are living and working on, and I know it's important to, particularly in this work that we do, which we call community-based research. We're going to, each of us will introduce ourselves, and then we'll go through the content. You could see the screen. We've put up the PowerPoint. So we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology or ethics of engagement. Walter will talk about work that he's been doing in Haida Gwaii, and Suriani is going to talk about her experiences as a PhD student, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So let me just, I'll introduce myself and then ask Walter and Suriani to introduce themselves before I begin. My name is Bud Hall, and I'm an adult educator and a community development retired professor from the University of Victoria. And I've been working in participatory research now for nearly 50 years, a long time. If people can mute their microphones unless you're speaking, it'll help us, because so many people on, there's a lot of opportunities for background engagement. I'm currently the co-chair of something called the UNESCO Chair for Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. And together with my colleague Rajesh Tandon from India, we support a training program in community-based research called the Knowledge for Change Consortium for Training in Community-Based Research. So I'll ask Walter if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Can you listen well? Good. My name is Walter Lepore. I'm originally from Argentina. I have been working with Pat and Rajesh at the UNESCO chair for the last 6 years. First as a project coordinator, and now as a research coordinator. I got my PhD from the University of Victoria, from the School of Public Administration in 2018. And now I'm also working part-time at Royal Roads University, here also in Vancouver Island, in the School of Environment and Sustainability. I'm doing a postdoc there. And also I'm an associate faculty at Royal Roads University, teaching in 2 different programs, in the leadership program, but also in the School of Environment and Sustainability. And as Bob mentioned before, I will be talking about one case of my postdoctoral research done in Haida Gwaii, in the northwest. It's an archipelago. It's a group of islands in northern BC, with it has a very particular story about colonization and the Haida people that I will speak a little bit later. So I want to thank Willie for this opportunity, and CASAE as well. And I appreciate the time you are allocating to this exciting webinar. Thank you very much. Suriani?
Thank you, Walter, Bud, and Willie. Hi, everybody. My name is Suriani Dzulkifli. I'm originally from Malaysia. I'm currently a PhD candidate at UVic. My research is focused on adult education, social justice, and arts-based practices. I'm currently also working closely with Bud and Walter in the UNESCO chair for community-based research and social responsibility in higher education as a program coordinator. And previously I was working at the Canadian Bureau for International Education out of my undergraduate studies, and I just ended my 3-year term with the UVic Student Affairs. Today, I'll be sharing with all of you my experience conducting my doctoral studies using CBPR approaches, which I'll explain later in the presentation. Back to you, Welly.
Okay, I think I'll just move on. So I'll take on. So when Welly invited us to share our thoughts about community-based research, we thought that it would be good to explore a little, get into a bit more depth, and so we talked about this. The title of our session is Community-Based Research, a methodology or an ethics of engagement. And one thing I wanted to point out is that it's very important that there's quite a lot of confusion in research, in the world of research, between the words methodology and methods. And probably most of you have discussions, where you're teaching or studying about the difference. But basically, the notion of methodology is that it is an approach. It's an approach. It's an epistemological approach. It's a ontological. It's the overview of how you understand or wish to understand for your study. What is knowledge and how is knowledge constructed. Methodology does not determine the methods. The methods are the things like interviews, or like doing mapping, or doing arts-based research, or using focus groups or photo voice. All of those things are methods, and those are not determined by the methodology. So on one hand, you could say that community-based research is a methodology, but we want to go a little bit deeper, and we want to call it an ethics of engagement. And the PowerPoint, the slide which I've just put up that you can see, is a way of kind of going through the differences between the way we see things in community-based research. And you may very well have questions, so jot your questions down, and when we come to the question period, we'll be able to help you out with those questions. So when you think about community-based research, you have to think about who are the researchers, who conducts the research. Well, for us, it's members of community, or people outside of the university. It could be an indigenous community. It could be a group of single mothers. It could be a group of young people at risk. It could be any kind of, or outside of the university. And within this paradigm, this ethics of engagement, the university researchers are part are researchers, but also the community members are also researchers. If you think about the purpose of research, the traditional academic approach is we're going to, you hear talking about contribution to the body of knowledge. And that's this kind of work, of course, can contribute to that, but it's not enough. The purpose of community-based research, or participatory research, or participatory action research, all of these are similar words for the same stuff, is to contribute to the betterment of a particular community. it's a social change or a social justice orientation. So that it's not enough just to write a paper or publish something. Um, so what who's it intended to serve? Well, it's done for on behalf of those people who are the intended beneficiaries. So if you're working with street involved youth, then the idea is that the work will strengthen the self-confidence, the ability to organize, the ability of street involved youth to advocate for what they need from society and so forth. um, so then the question is, whose knowledge counts? It's a big one, because what we're saying is that the experiential knowledge of people living in situations of exclusion or oppression is also knowledge, and that knowledge is to some extent privileged knowledge, because only people who are experiencing domestic abuse are going to be experts to that degree, much more so than academics who tend to prefer abstract approaches to knowledge, which can be shared easily and don't make you feel uncomfortable. um, where does the topic come from? The question, many of you, if you're students here, everybody's saying, well, what's your research question? And for us, the research question is, it comes from the community. Now, it may be co-facilitated, by ourselves, but if it doesn't resonate, if it doesn't have the community or the group of people you're working with, if it's not of interest, not going to help them, then it's not really community-based research. Um, similar, you can see the implications of this work, the rationale. Why would we choose this approach? Well, we choose the approach for empowerment, for collective advocacy, for mutual learning, for the building of self-confidence, all of these kinds of things. And those are quite different from a traditional approach, which where the pursuit of truth or objectivity is the ultimate goal. Ownership's a big issue. Ownership of the knowledge. So we have in Canada, we've got we've got what they call OCAP principles, which have been developed originally working with indigenous communities, which means that the community has ownership, control, access, and protection, and it has the right to determine how the knowledge is shared. What we often say in our work, with our UNESCO chair, is that we want to strike a balance between the right of communities to own their own knowledge, their own culture, language, and knowledge, and the right of other people to have free and open access to knowledge which is created in academic settings. So it varies. The question of ownership is a very important one, and it's determined contextually, case by case by case by case. If there's 50 of us on this conversation, there'll be 50 different answers to how that's worked out. And same thing with a means of dissemination. Obviously for academics, conferences and journals and books are the way that we share our information. But when we're doing this kind of work, if we're trying to influence policy or to make life better for people, we need to think much more broadly about the way that information is shared, amongst in non-academic settings, because the public nobody reads journals other than other academics. So how does the public get its information? So we need to be thinking about social media, about use of arts-based theater, and murals and poetry and, and videos, and all kinds of other things, public meetings, and all of that. So those are, that's I realize that's, but um, one thing we will make available to all of you. I think Walter will do it, or maybe it'll be Welly, whoever has the, probably be Welly, whoever has the email addresses for everybody. We have a handbook, a short handbook on community-based participatory research. This particular slide came from that book, and it's a short one, 12, 15 pages, which would be, it's got lots of references and would be a really good, kind of piece for you to, each of you to have. So we'll be able to provide that free, to everybody. Once we figure out, probably Walter to Welly to the rest of you. So write down your questions. You'll have some, I'm sure, right now. As I'm speaking, you've probably thought, well, what about this? Jot it down. Don't forget it. They're all important. And then we can come back to that. So I will turn the chair over to, I'll give the microphone to Walter for his story. And I will, Walter, you tell me when to, or just signal me, and I'll operate the slides.
Okay, thank you, Bud. Yes, we can proceed with the next slide, please. So before I start talking,
There goes. There it is.
Very cool. Thank you. Before I explain the goals of the case study, let me give you some context about this research. So in 1993, the government of Canada and the Haida Nation signed an agreement to plan, manage, and operate Waihanas, that is a national park, through the Archipelago Management Board, the AMB. The AMB is composed of three representatives of the Haida Nation and 3 representatives of the government of Canada, 2 from Parks Canada and 1 from the Department of Fisheries and Ocean. And Waihanas Park is a quite complicated, quite complex ecosystem that is 5,000 square kilometers, that's the dimension, and comprises a national park, a marine conservation area, and a Haida heritage site. And in 2018, after 6 years of planning, the AMB published what is called the Land, Sea, and People Management Plan, LSP plan, to manage Waihanas as a single interconnected ecosystem. This is the first management plan in Canada for an integrated terrestrial and marine protected area. Usually you will find a management plan for a marine protected area, or a management plan for a terrestrial area, or a management plan for cultural heritage sites. But this is the first one that integrates the 3 aspects of Waihanas into one single management plan. As you can imagine, this is not only quite challenging to design the plan, but even more difficult to implement the plan. And this is the stage where the AMB is right now, in the implementation stage. And they found several issues affecting the implementation of the plan. One of them are the conflicts between different worldviews, different values, and different traditions of stakeholders and actors implicated in the management of Waihanas. We are talking people with different cultures, but also different knowledge systems. Sorry, I forgot to mention that in that agreement that was signed in 1993 is a very paradigmatic agreement, that on one side, the agreement is written in Haida language, and in the other side, it's written in English. And this is the first agreement of this kind, where basically they agree on disagreeing. they don't try to integrate both values and come up with something new or different. Basically, they say that we are going to respect our own identity, our own values, and our own cultures, and we are going to work together on the management of Waihanas. But obviously, this is easier to say than to apply, because when there are different knowledge systems, different people with different epistemologies working together, that's when different power differences start to emerge, right? And when we talk about power differences, we can see them through different views of ownership, as Bud talked about the OCAP principle, different ownerships of the planning system, but also of the knowledge creation process and the outcomes of that process, right? So when these power differences between knowledge systems emerge, we can see that the chances of consensus buildings are reduced. And at the same time, and this is quite common in cooperative management of protected areas, there is always the dominance of one system over the others, right? And this dominance sometimes, but not always, but sometimes is related to who holds the money, right? Because who holds the money determines who leads the decision-making and planning process. So that being said, that's the general context where my case study is embedded. My case study, the objective is to investigate basically the complex relationship between different factors, political, social, economic, and environmental, obviously, at a local scale, and how the traditional knowledge and scientific Western knowledge can be incorporated into governance systems of Waihanas National Park. And when I'm talking about traditional knowledge, it's not only indigenous knowledge, it's indigenous knowledge and also local knowledge, basically knowledge developed by non-indigenous people somehow. And this traditional knowledge is constructed in a different way from the scientific knowledge. We are talking about, for example, experiential learning, we're talking about observations and all other differences that also Bud mentioned in the previous slide. So basically the overarching goal of my case study is to contribute to the implementation of the LSP plan that I just described by investigating and applying different measures that can ensure that human activities in Waihanas, mostly fisheries, but also tourism, are ecologically sustainable, but that can also provide social, cultural, and economic benefits to local communities, indigenous and non-indigenous communities. And in this research, I'm working basically with the Archipelago Management Board, but also with the Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada. And building this relationship is still an ongoing process. This is probably the most difficult aspect of this and any other community-based research project, that you have to build that relationship with your partners, right? So I'm really lucky and grateful that I'm working with my postdoctoral supervisor at Royal Roads, Dr. Leslie King, who has more than 25 years working with the Haida people. And that obviously helped me to open a lot of doors and connect with these people. Otherwise, would have been very, very difficult for me. And we have to basically pay a visit to Haida in September 2019, basically to check with them if my research was relevant, right? That's something that is not very common when you do traditional research. You assume that the people will be interested, or sometimes some researchers don't even care if the participants are interested or not. They just want to collect some data, analyze it, and then publish. But in this case, since the final goal of CBR is to take action, I wanted to be sure that the outcomes of my research will be of value for the local communities, right? That's where we have to go there, spend a week talking with different people, connecting with them, and basically having their approval to conduct this research. So next slide, please. So, and together, we basically came up with this research question, that is, how can we design or change institutions to reflect conflicting and divergent environmental values, objectives, and cultural beliefs, while simultaneously preventing the appropriation, exploitation, and domination of one knowledge system over the other, so the scientific versus the non-scientific knowledge system, and the resulting misfits between institutions and social ecological systems. Very complex question that obviously is divided into sub-questions. But this was the question that was relevant for my partners. And this is critical, right? When you are doing CBR, you have to do something that your local partners can find like useful for them to take action. As I said, I'm adopting a participatory approach, but it's basically an in-depth case study where I'm using, let's say, traditional data collection tools, interviews, focus groups, observations, and also documentary data. So I wanted to show you this case because, as Bud mentioned, CBR is more kind of an approach rather than a methodology. Because as you can see, the data collection tools are tools that you can see also in mostly traditional research. Interviews and focus groups or surveys are quite common in our kind of knowledge creation processes, right? But the way the research question was developed, the way the data will be collected and will be analyzed, is basically adopting a participatory approach, right? That's what I have to establish this relationship with the Haida Nation, the Parks Canada, and the IMB, because we are going to work together for the next 2 years on this, right? So next slide, please. And as I mentioned, when you are talking with, when you're doing CBR, you have to consider that stakeholder engagement is critical. Because if you don't have your partners engaged with your process, that there is no way it can be successful, right? It's important also to integrate dialogue, deliberations, the inclusion of different social values into technical analysis. As Bud also mentioned, I'm respecting the principles of indigenous ownership, control, access, and possession, the OCAP principles over the research process, that basically they guarantee that the research will bring benefits to the community while minimizing harm. That would be the big umbrella, the OCAP principles. But then I have to also pay attention to the local laws, the Haida laws. Respect, to ask first, to make it right, and basically follow the principle of everything depends on everything else. Everything is connected. So that's also important when you're doing CBR. You have to know the local customs, the local traditions, the local laws, and respect them. That's very important because CBR is all about trust and trust-based relationships. And that takes a lot of time to build, but one single mistake can bring that relationship down. So if you are interested in doing CBR, be sure that you know the protocols, you know the laws, you know the principles that the local people embrace, and follow them, respect those. And next slide. And everything was, I will respond those questions, yeah, later. Thank you very much. And everything was going well, relatively well. And obviously the pandemic put a stop on my research for different reasons. First of all, Haida Y is closed to visitors. And the main reason for that is that they want to make sure that their elders and knowledge keepers and the people who are in charge of basically preserving their language are safe. Hawaii has a beautiful new hospital, but obviously the ICU units are quite reduced, and they can't take that risk, right? They have to protect their elders. That's first of all. Since it's impossible to go and visit Hawaii right now, there are obviously challenges associated to getting information out to the communities. Not all the communities have, I mean, some of them have some internet connectivity problems, or not everybody has the chance of have a virtual meeting room and so on. Then, as I said, people are not allowed to go and visit. The in-person contact has been suspended, and that's a major issue when you're doing CBR, that you need to meet face-to-face. You have to go and visit the place. There are a lot of field visits and field work that has to be done. Obviously, now there are different options to address this issue, but for me, it's still not the same. I like the face-to-face interaction, right? And then there is an ethical aspect when you're doing community-based research. That is basically that all community-engaged research is about relationships. And this is the most important aspect for me, that when the community is in crisis, right, like now, they cannot be abandoned just because research cannot progress. Because that's basically the situation that many people doing CPR is right now. Since you cannot go and visit, okay, let's stop until we can connect again. But they're in crisis. They still need support. You need to check with them, even if you cannot do research, because the relationship with the communities goes beyond research, or this particular research. This is a 2-year project. But my intention is to be connected with them for a longer period of time, obviously. I want to do more research with them, right? So I cannot just limit my support and my interest in them just to my research. That is a project with very specific timeline and so on. So that's important to consider. You cannot abandon them. So those are the implications that the pandemic has imposed to my research, but we're finding ways to address some of them. And obviously we have to wait until some of these measures are removed to go and start working again in the field, hopefully. So that's a very short description of my case study, and it will address your questions at the end. Thank you very much, and I pass the mic to Suriani.
Thank you, Walter, very much for that very rich. You know, in a relatively short time, presented some of the richness and the complexity of doing this kind of work, and particularly drawn to your notion that we cannot abandon, you know, our communities when they are in crisis. So thank you very much, and we'll come back to you with questions in a short time. So Suriani, the floor is now open to you to talk about your current work as a PhD student.
Thank you very much, Bud. Okay, so before I get into the main objectives, I'd like to just quickly explain how I come, how do I come to create this research and why I'm interested in working with international students. Well, that's because I'm one of them. I'm an international student. All of my post-secondary education has been done here in Canada. And through my engagement with other international students, as well as my previous experience working with the Canadian Bureau for International Education, as well as, coming here at UVic and whatnot, all of those experiences that I have experienced up until today, up until the day that this research was proposed, sort of informed my interest in the research. And my main objective for this research was to analyze how international students come to their consciousness about social justice issues through their learnings at UVic. And we know as the educators that learning does not only confine to formal learning, which is, you know, what always happens in the classroom, the traditional way of learning, but we also acknowledge that learning happens non-formally, which is sort of somewhat structured. You won't necessarily get credits for it, but you do it out of your interest. As well as learning happens informally. What that means is that through your engagement and interactions, casually on everyday basis, you know, you do learn something. It might not occur to you there and then that that's what you're learning, but something, you know, let's say you read a newspaper and then you say, oh, right, I saw this, you know, at so-and-so, and, you know, that triggered your learning. So I was interested to see how the formal, non-formal, and informal learning that the UVic internship students has had, and what are the effects of this type of learnings into their present life as well as in their future. But my other specific objectives is, on top of that, is also to identify some informed actions for internship students, how they can contribute to social change wherever they end up after, you know, whether in Canada or in their future, in their hometown. And then lastly, I'm also using arts-based practices in my research, you know, as a tool to encourage critical consciousness and also to bring up in-depth discussion surrounding social justice issue. And the research question that I've come up with is, how have UVic internship students come to consciousness, right, through these three types of learning, and what are the implications for it once, you know, they return home. Next slide, Bud. So, right, the method that I used was participatory arts-based method, but more specifically visual arts-based. And I also did an in-depth group discussion. So it came naturally through the arts-based, followed with an in-depth discussion. So the arts kind of provoked those discussions. And also I've had individual interviews. And the data collection for this research was that I organized a 3-day arts-based workshop, and I specifically used photographs, so readily available photographs. Fortunately for me, my supervisor has this stack of photographs in her collection. I managed to borrow it from her for my workshop. And then we also did a collage where I did them in pairs, because I was interested in seeing the cooperation among themselves in smaller groups. So the photographs was to see how they learn in the formal setting, you know, their reflections and whatnot with their experiences at UVic. The collage was to see the non-formal learning that they have had at UVic. And also, lastly, I used photo voice, which is to capture the informal learnings that they have had at UVic. So essentially, we went with photo voice. We went around the campus. I gave them about an hour. Went around the campus. They took photographs of how they might have observed things regarding social justice issues on campus that they may have not noticed then. And also, before, you know, doing all of this, I of course had a discussion regarding what art-based workshop, how does it situate, what art-based practices are, how do they situate it in the study, in the bigger picture as well as the small picture, what the benefits are, things like that. And I also started, because I did a pre and post workshop interviews to analyze their processes in learning. The pre-workshop interviews that I did, most of them haven't had the exposure or the experiences of going through arts-based as a learning tool. So we had a discussion around that as well. And also I facilitated an icebreaker that uses, that, you know, encouraging them to draw, sort of, you know, getting them to be comfortable with the art, slowly ease into the other methods. And then I also conducted the post-workshop interview in the fall. So in the fall, at the end of the fall term, so not too long ago, I wrapped up in December of last year. And I offered the pre and post interviews to be conducted whether in person, if they're on campus, as well as on Skype, if it's more convenient, just to give them a bit more flexibility. And then the research participant are 6 UVic international students. They are a mix of graduate and undergraduate student. And also would like to highlight that I was also a research participant. So what that means is that I conducted the research, but I also participated in the research as well. Next slide, Bud. So my research per se is not tradition, it's not it's more, it has a lot of CBPR approaches, not necessarily framed in the CBR framework, where I didn't co-create the questions with other international students. I sort of just came up with the question, obviously with the supervision of my supervisor. But what at UVic, when you are an international student, they have this community called the global community. So I was all international students is part of the global community. How active you are and whatnot, it's completely up to you, your engagement with the group. But that already had created, a community where international students could go ask questions, meet other people, this and that, and they host events and whatnot as well. So I already have had pre-existing relationship with the global community. And the global community is an initiative by the International Student Services at UVic. So, I already have pre-existing relationship with the staff there, where we would say like it's a tight-knit community, although they're staff, but they're also very student friendly, very down to earth, very approachable. So when I was thinking of doing this research, right, I had contacted them regarding helping me with recruiting other international students. So they played a part where they had supported me to recruit international students. So what they did was I set up a poster, calling out for full-time UVic international students, so give a description of what was going to be, where it was going to be held, things like that. And then they had posted the poster in their Facebook page account. And also they had sent it out through their newsletter, as well as they had put the poster in their office, so that international student could get in touch with me if they're interested. So that was a great help in getting international students to to participate in my research. So then again, another thing that has been emphasized with CBPR is that the importance of relationship, right? So at UVic, we have about 3,000 international students. It's impossible for everyone to know everyone, although you might recognize faces, this and that, but you may not necessarily be familiar with them. So at the beginning of the workshop that I organized, I facilitated an icebreaker so that other international students could know each other, could be familiarized with each other. So the workshop was for that purpose. And again, as I mentioned, I also incorporated art in that, so they are at ease with their art ability, so so they're more confident, and to see that they themselves are capable of being engaged in the arts. And the next thing that I did was, before even starting with my first activity, we together had co-created a research workshop committee guideline that we were going to use for the rest of the 3 days. So I give them the ownership to create this guideline. It came from them, where they wrote a paper, they discussed what sort of guidelines that they had agreed on, and this also proceeded to help create a safer space for them where they could talk freely and they respect each other and have the trust there built over time. And I was very amazed by the trust that they had built over the past 3 days, and they managed to discuss very, very personal and vulnerable things based on the experiences regarding social justice issues that had occurred through their 3 learnings. They managed to connect that with their past experiences, with their experiences in the classroom, just on campus. Most of them are negative experiences, some are positive as well. And then as well, I used participatory arts-based methods, as I mentioned earlier. And the last thing, it might seem very, very trivial, but food has the power in helping to bond people. So my workshop occurred over lunch. So what I did was also I treated them to lunch, or I had breakfast in the morning, because again, as a community, when you come together, you don't only learn together, but you also eat together, right? And through that process, they get to know each other a lot more, and they in a more casual environment. And I believe that also helped them to be more at ease with each other and to be able to discuss more issues in depth. So yeah, so these are some of the approaches that I had incorporated into my research based on the CBPR guidelines that I had studied in a course that I took. I actually took a research methods course in community-based research. Next slide, Bud. So that's currently I'm in the stage where I'm analyzing my data and also writing my thesis. And since we're in the pandemic, I thought it'll be timely for me to share some tips of working as a graduate student in the pandemic. As many graduate students know, although you're a graduate student, your responsibility does not only lie in writing your thesis and conducting your research. For myself, I'm also involved in other projects with, for example, one with Bud, working with the UNESCO chair. I'm also working with a project with my supervisor, and I just ended a project that I was working with the Office of Student Life at UVic, where we looked at sexualized violence prevention education. So all of these were happening while I was conducting my research, and also while, and two other projects are currently ongoing right now. So in the pandemic, I've to admit that it's not an easy, smooth sailing process, to write your thesis. The first week for me was amazing. I felt very productive. The change was great. But then I started to feel uneasy. I started to feel restless. So then prioritizing your safety and security should come first and foremost. You should be able to feel like you're safe, that your financial responsibilities are met, get your family life sorted out, this and that. So once you have that structured, then you can start thinking of productive ways to structure your learning around. So for myself, I've created a accountability or support system. So what I do is that I reach out to friends, I talk about my PhD, they will listen to me. And at UVic, we also have these virtual writing groups where you can pop in and out as you like on certain days. But I do know that there are also other independent virtual writing groups available online. So if you just Google, and usually it's internationally. Otherwise, you could also create a virtual writing group with your peers as well, who are in the same boat. And then another thing was that because I'm involved in so many things, that sometimes can get very, very overwhelmed, that I have come up with a strategy that I write 3 attainable goals that I would like to achieve in that day. So then this not only organize my thoughts, but it also shifts my focus on what I need to work on for that day. And that has worked wonders. I managed to optimize my productivity with the energy that I have and mental capacity that I have in these pandemic times. But also, it was also important for me to recognize that my productivity level for every day differs, and I should listen to how I feel. So some days when I don't feel like writing, I work on other projects, and switch that around. When I feel super motivated and inspired, then I would give my hours to writing. But I also do it in chunks of blocks. I don't do it traditionally where you're in the office, where if you have 9 to 5, you work the first few hours and I take a break the first few hours. But more so now I work probably like in small chunks where an hour and then take a break, an hour type of thing. I find that a bit more realistic in the situation that we're in. So then don't forget to take breaks, stretch, move around. Sometimes I would also leave my home. We are in Canada, at least in Victoria, we were still fortunate we can go outside and walk around for a couple of minutes, an hour to whatever, just to get some fresh air and change the scenery, change your mindset, and then come back, look at what you want to work again. So yeah, that's all that I have for today, and I welcome any questions that you have regarding my research experience as well as my personal experience as a graduate student. Thank you.
Bud?
Bud, you're still muted, Bud.
Hi there. Thank you, Suriani, very much for those insights. I think the idea of having goals and prioritizing your own safety and security, you know, we tend to, as academics, tend to think it's just about our writing and our productivity, but we can't separate. Never can we separate our productivity from the life world that we're a part of. So thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I think, Welly, I think you are in a better position to be able to, you know, to facilitate the questions. And then depending on the question, either Walter or Suriani or I can answer. So I'm turning it back over to you, Welly, to figure out how the questions are going to work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have 3 questions so far. One, the first one is from Annie to Walter. Annie asked, how do we prepare research funding proposals when you are still in a process of engaging and working with the community in developing the project?
It's a really good question, and it's very difficult to do, because sometimes what we have done is basically to say that we are going to do a participatory research project, and we describe how the process will evolve, how we are going to co-develop the questions, the analysis, the data collection, and so on. Because as you understand, right? If you are still developing the relationship and building or thinking about the questions, and you have to submit a grant application, usually for a grant application, you need to have all these aspects very well defined: the research question, the method, the analysis. So that's one strategy, is basically describe the process, because it's more than just a project, it's a process, right? And you can describe how you are basically going to develop the specific question. You can present a general question that eventually will be divided into more specific, that will come from the work with your partners. In my case, for example, my interest was the incorporation of different knowledge systems. All the different details about that long question that I presented was developed with my partners. But at the time of submitting a grant application, I don't go to so many details. The other side is not so great, is that, and I have to be honest, most funding agencies, I will not say that they don't like CBR projects, but I would say that sometimes they don't understand how they work. So they prefer a very linear, traditional project actually, where you already have your question, you already have your data collection tools and analysis, and you know what the final outcome will be. But in a CBR process, that sometimes is uncertain, right? And I will say that lots of understand the complexities of a CBR project. So it's not very uncommon to get rejected, right? So, and sometimes it all comes to the committee who evaluates the application. If people in the committee have some more knowledge about what CBR is, your chances are greater. If the committee is dominated by people with a very traditional approach, chances are reduced, right? So it's complex. I don't have a specific answer how to deal with that actually.
Thank you, Walter. Bud, Suriani, you guys want to add anything?
No.
Suriani? So the next two questions is directed to Suriani. So the first question was by Dr. Shauna. So Suriani, an important project to capture these various learning of international students. How was the main research question determined? Was it an issue that emerged from the wider community of international students? And I will read the second question already. So I am challenged with the fundamental question while engaged in a kind of discussion. What is the community? Or what is not a community? Suriani, you might help us understand as you are introducing international students as a community. You don't need to answer right now, but just a thought. So.
All right, okay, thank you for the two questions, Shauna and I think Kapil. So Shauna, just to answer your question, so how it came up was basically from my personal experience that I thought was isolated, but I also had other international student friends that I have these conversations with, especially when I continued my graduate studies at UVic. So I'll give you a context of how I come, how I come about to the research question. So my experiences as an undergraduate student was very, very different from my graduate studies. So in undergraduate, as an international student, I felt that I was being silenced a lot in the classroom. As you know, in undergraduate, the pedagogy for learning, it's very, very westernized. And I hear me as an international student came with my pre-existing knowledge with the Malaysian context mostly, sitting in the classroom full of mostly Canadians, and then when we are in small groups and having discussions regarding a certain topic and I bring up my Malaysian experiences, it was highly either, dismissed, ignored, no one asked follow-up question, things like that. So I felt very, very silent in my undergraduate, right? But when I started my graduate studies at UVic, the experience was very, very different. That could be because of the level of the studies, but I find that, I was given this platform to share, and suddenly my Malaysian experience was relevant. And in fact, it was even encouraged to have different perspective that's not Western or Canadian. So it was a little bit overwhelming in a good way at some point, because now I feel like, right, my experiences is valid. And I think having this kind of conversation with my other international friends, they have said the same thing as well. And it also came up at the discussion that we have in the 3-day workshop, where most the undergraduate international students especially, they feel very silent. They feel like no one had wanted to talk about the social justice issues outside of Canada. And I think with the discussion with my supervisor and whatnot, she helps me to frame it in such a way that I could capture the learning that does not only happen informal, because most of the learning that international students have had the participants have had came from the non-formal setting, and also a little bit informal, but mostly non-formal, not so much in the formal setting, especially in the that's also how they've come about to learn about other new issues that they either witnesses or read about in the news, or when they go for a workshop, they've learned about the experiences of the indigenous community here in Canada with resident schools and whatnot, because at UVic, there's a lot of indigenous polls on campus, so that also kind of provoked them to find out what are they, why is it there, what's the significance of it. So it started as a personal experience, and then it became a wider community question as well, as I figured out, as I found out myself that it wasn't an isolated experience. And the second question, Kapil, about what is community? I'm glad you brought this. I'm glad you brought this question up, because mostly when we think of community, right, we think of it as a very traditional way where community is, a place or a neighborhood or people who, live close to each other. But there's actually a few researchers that said that, especially John Annette mentioned that there are actually argued that there are four different ways that people can be perceived as community. So the first one, of course, the traditional way that most people know and familiar and aware of. And the second one is community that are linked by normative ideals to values, such as, respect, solidarity, inclusion. And the third way that he explained community as a founded cultural identities and or similar interests, right? So in the case of international students, they are all interested in pursuing pursuing their studies abroad, in this case Canada and at UVic. And the fourth way of looking at community is that it can be described as a political ideal linked to participation, involvement, and citizenship. And sometimes communities also embody more than one of these definitions. So in the case of international students, they may have come from different backgrounds, different countries, but as I mentioned earlier, they have the same interest of pursuing their post-secondary education abroad in this case. And then some, at the same time, they are also in solidarity with each other. They can empathize on their unique situation of being, away from home for the purpose of getting an education, or, for the purpose of studying and living abroad. And some of them also face challenges, similar challenges, if not necessarily the same. And in this case, UVic students, they are all studying in the same institution, so they are community situated in that sense.
I have a brief comment about the second question about what communities. We usually work with organized community. This means people in different networks or groups or civil society organizations, rather than just scatter people in a specific neighborhood or area, right? So the question in that case, when you work with organized communities, is not only what community is, but how you can assure that your partner is a representative of the community you want to work with, right? Because obviously you can have people who say that they represent the community of interest, but they don't, right? So this is why the building that relationship is very important, because in the same way the community needs to know you, who you are, why you're interested, how the information will be used, and so on. You also need to know your partners and understand or know if they actually represent the people you want to work with, right? So that's a different kind of layer, different kind of complexity, but it's also important to consider depending on the kind of community you're working with.
Thank you, Suriani. Thank you, Walter. Shauna is commenting that CIHR is strongly oriented to CBR, and SHRC now has partnership grants that support CBR as well. So I have 3 other questions here. They're kind of close to each other, and they are directed to all the presenters. So the first one is, if communities are not involved in planning on research, developing on the research questions and process of research, I wonder if we still claim this is a CBR. Any thoughts around this? So the second one is, what are examples of beneficial outcomes for the local communities through this methodology? What are some challenges you have faced and how did you address these challenges? And the third one is how to get people involved, how to get specific communities, school or people to be part of the research process.
Just the first question, I'd say my answer is no. That if the communities or a group of people that that you're writing about aren't involved in somehow in the design of the process, or some aspects of the process, not a community-based research project. But let me say this: there are lots of good there's a lot of good that can be done that isn't community-based research. So if you're interested in social justice issues, community-based research is not the only approach. It's not the only kind of ethics of engagement to follow. There may be a time when, for example, let's talk about the increase in domestic violence during the pandemic. There may be, if you've got a research process which you can document without interviews, but document increases of domestic violence during the pandemic, then that's a very important important data. It's not community-based research, but it is certainly social justice research. So I think don't I have a lot of students who agonize over, oh well, I can't really do community-based research, and they somehow the feeling is, oh well, I'm not really doing social justice. But that's not true. There's a lot of ways to do socially just, egalitarian things that contribute, and that's my response to question number one. I'll let others speak to 2 and 3.
Yeah, I have just a brief comment that in one of the books that is available in our repository resource list, there are 27 different types of CBR, or that can be called CBR. So it's kind of a continuum, right? Where basically you can have a full involvement of the community in the construction of the research question, the data collection analysis, and the ownership of the data and the dissemination of the data. But in some other cases, the degree of involvement and engagement is not totally, right? And it's not a total kind of involvement. So instead of white or black or white, is participatory or non-participatory, there are different degrees of involvement, and you can basically categorize your research in one of those different types of CBR, right?
So the third question was about how to get people involved, how to get specific communities, schools, and people to be part of the research.
Walter and Suriani, you want to start, and I can come in?
I will say dialogue, continuous dialogue is very important. Keep the community informed as well. Not only that you just touch base at the beginning of your research process, or where you're writing the grant application, and then when you start the collecting data, you have to keep them informed on a regular basis, right? Because you want to build that relationship. There was also a question that I saw before, it was, when are people supposed to contact the community before writing the grant proposal, for example? I would say yes, definitely. For 2 different reasons. One, as I said, keep them informed, but also you need to know if what you want to do is relevant for them, because you have to always keep in mind that the final goal of CBR is to take action. It's not only to produce a new paper or a book. No, it's to actually solve a real life problem. And in that case, you need to know what the problem is, how the people experience and understand that problem in order to provide them with some tools that can actually use in real life, right? So that's when one of the questions is what could be an outcome of that process is. There are many different ways. You can write policy brief, you can write an action plan, you can actually go to the field and implement some of the actions working with the communities. But basically you need to know what they need. When you understand what they need and how your research can be relevant for them, I think that also brings more richness to the project. And I would say probably more chances of getting a grant, because it's not only a theoretical important question, it's also an empirical product that you can bring to the table, right? But it all depends on what the community needs and what you can bring to them, basically.
I would also just like to expand a bit that, you know, the way that you could also bring about change direction is also if you're using arts-based methods that you could have in exhibition and then call policy makers. If you're doing theater, invite them. That's also another way of doing it. But also just to agree on Walter, you have to have the communication with the community before you even propose and design it, because then with CBPR, the trust and the relationship building is what's most important. And it's sometimes it takes a lot of time to build that trust. You know, there's probably going to be a lot of back and forth before you could agree on something. But that's the nature of it. When you want to involve a community and you want to collaborate with them, you have to build that relationship and that trust from the get-go, so that it's a true partnership between, you know, the researchers as well as the community.
This is Bud. Several thoughts. I agree with what Walter and Suriani have said. I sometimes think we talk about the question how to get people involved, but you know, another way of framing that question is how do we get involved? You know, with people. So if we are not involved, for example, you know, as a white male non-indigenous person, you know, and I want to work respectfully, you know, with you know, people who are indigenous or, you know, differently located than myself, it's not a question of how I get other people involved. How do I get involved, you know, in a respectful, you know, way, supportive and a listening way. So I sometimes think that when we talk about community-based, or we use any of these words, participatory research or PAR or whatever we use, different engaged scholarship, we're actually talking about a fundamentally different relationship between knowledge, authority, you know, and society, or knowledge, authority, power, and community. And we have to understand that knowledge exists, you know, in the community, you know, as powerful and as you know, relevant, you know, as any knowledge in the academy. And so when we talk about it, sometimes a kind of, you know, dualistic way. We've got knowledge in the academy and knowledge in the community, but in fact, it's much more complex than that. And knowledge, you know, or the, you know, ways of understanding the world, you know, they run right throughout, you know, all of life, all of the planet, you know, and so forth. So it's you know, when we begin to work, you know, from this this kind of ethics of engagement approach, you know, it really, it's very exciting. It's very, very exciting, and it can be, you know, extremely complicated. But you know, it really goes back to what, you know, many of you know, what Walter and Suriani have all said as well. It's about the centrality of relationships. It's that you know, it's that just and respectful relationship, you know, around you know, what counts as knowledge, whose knowledge counts, that lies. And that means to some degree thinking of ourselves, you know, when we think of ourselves as academics, not dividing ourselves so much into, you know, sort of here's our academic identity, and then here's our civil identity, or our social movement, our identity, you know, or our activist identity. And when you're doing this, we think of ourselves as more holistic. And you know, I'm an activist, I'm a intellectual, you know, I'm a retired professor, whatever. But all of these things are all connected, they're all part of me. And I'm not, my relationship with, you know, with Wasanich elders isn't a research relationship. It's one that I've built, you know, over, you know, the last 15, 20 years here in Victoria. And it's one that will go on till the day I die. And the same thing, you know, in terms of, you know, I'm probably, you know, making this a lot more philosophical than is practical, but it is about relationships, and it's about uh, it's about freeing ourselves in some way, freeing ourselves from the constraints that the label academic and academician and scholar has placed on us, and allowing us to be open to, you know, to artistic and to cultural and to other language, to other ways of knowing.
I have two suggestions, very brief suggestions on how to engage with people and get people engaged with your research. First of all, learn to listen and observe. It's very important to listen to what the community has to say, because most people that go from the university to the community, they think they have all the answers, right? That they know more than them. And that's not usually the case. So it's very important that your first contact with the community is about listening them, right? What they need, what they want, what they are good at, what are the challenges they are facing. The second one will be learn to work outside of comfort zone. And this is one of the lessons, or something that a very experienced community-based researcher told me when I just started working in this field. If you're doing CBR and you are comfortable doing it, you are doing it wrong, most likely. Because doing CBR is about shaking all your previous belief, what you know, your knowledge that you have incorporated at universities at different levels of education, right? And so if you feel comfortable, it's probably done wrongly. You have to feel that you are outside your comfort zone, and you have to learn how to work with that feeling, right? That, this is not, I'm used to, this is not the kind of knowledge that I acquire over so many years, and that's fine, right? Because related to that, there is also a process of unlearning, right? You have to unlearn a few things, some pre-assumptions that you can bring from the university. So there is a lot of that. You have to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation and feel okay with that, right? So it's not easy to do, but it's important. So that would be my two brief recommendations.
Thank you, Walter. So our time is almost done. And any final thoughts, Bud, Suriani, Walter?
Um, well, thank you, Welly, and thank you, those of you who ask questions. Feel free to contact us, outside of the experience, the webinar. You can track me down easily, and I can put you in touch with Walter and Suriani if you have specific follow-up questions for them. We have Canada has a rich tradition. It goes way, way, way back with people like Shauna Butterwick and so many others who were way back in the early 70s, building these foundations. And we have, I think, quite a well-deserved international reputation for promoting and advocating and getting funding for this kind of work. So we're in a wonderful situation compared to what the situation when I began working 40, 50 years ago, where nobody in a university you couldn't even use the word participatory research or action research. They didn't want to hear you. So we've come a long, long ways. But we live in a world, an academic world, that has been shaped by a monopoly of a particular Western form of understanding of what knowledge is and how knowledge is created. And it's going to take all of us, and it's going to have to be done project by project, community by community, issue by issue. It's going to take all of us, working along these ways in order to continue to make progress, so that we deepen our understanding, of this work, but more importantly, so that our work actually generates the changes, or contributes at least to the changes that we all hope for in society. So I'm thrilled. I can't imagine that we would have had over 50 people so many years ago interested in something like this, and all online. So I'm very grateful to all of you for your interest, and Welly and CASAE, thank you so very much for facilitating this. And I learned a lot from Walter and Suriani, even though I work with them. I learned a lot. So from my part, I just couldn't be happier with how it's turned out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bud. Walter, Suriani, you wanna say?
Yeah, I also want to thank everybody for attending to this webinar. Thank you, Jose, for organizing this. I just put in the chat box I left my email address in case people have more questions about Hideaway or my CPR project, because I think we're running out of time. Yeah, I addressed what Bud said, and just a minor question would be that even though we are strongly believe in the benefits of doing CPR, the truth is that not every research question can be answered adopting this approach, right? There are some other questions that need a different approach, because I saw a question about which method will be more effective for doing CPR, if quantitative or qualitative. I would say that depends. I'm a very pragmatic researcher in the sense that I let the question to lead the selection of methods. Otherwise, you are putting the cart in front of the horse. If you say, I want to do a quantitative research, how do you know, right? It depends on the question you need to answer. And there are many questions where you can use CPR, but in some other question, it's better to use a different kind of approach. In the same way I do CPR, I also do very quantitative traditional research, but because the question needs to be answered using those approaches and not CPR, right? So always pay attention to the question you want to answer before choosing your methods.
Right, and I just have just a short follow-up. I'm thankful to be here. I'm thankful that there's a lot of interest and participation in this webinar, in learning more about CBR. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to look up Orlando Fals-Borda. He's the founding father of CBR. Most of the materials may be in Spanish, but in today's world, you can get the dictionary, you can use Google Translator to translate, and he also has some YouTube videos, interviews on him. And as he urges us researchers to always work with our mind and our heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bud and Walter and Suriani. Thanks so much for being willing to do this, and thank you for the amazing webinar. So more webinars like this are coming. If you're attending this webinar and you're not a CASAE member yet, I would like to encourage you to find out more. So CASAE is a vibrant and energetic organization that provides a supportive network for graduate students, faculty members, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers who are engaged and interested in adult education scholarship. I just posted on the group chat more information. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you guys soon.
Peace.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Bud.
Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Suriani.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you, Suriani. Nice to meet you finally. In person.
Yes, Susie. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, thank you again, Welly. Hope everything is going well. Hope the baby's doing well.
Thank you, Susie.
Okay, take it easy.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Jose.
Thank you.
Jose.
Yep.
I will send you by email the presentation with a kind of a nicer background for you to distribute it. Is it okay?
Awesome. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Walter.
Thank you. I will send the email in a bit.
Okay. What about the Bud told me about the book, like a book.
Yeah. I will send you also that. I can send you the file, or I can actually send you the link. What do you think is